This program was made possible by contributions to your PBS station from viewers like you. Thank you.
John Bredar, we are so excited that you're here in Cookeville, and we're so thrilled that Walter Derryberry opened his beautiful home for us to tape in front of a live audience. We don't normally get to do this. You are the Vice President of National Programming for WGBH Boston. And you know, you produce, like I understand, 40% of the national content on PBS.
That's right, yeah.
Like Frontline, Antiques Roadshow, Nova, well, Masterpiece.
Of course.
How many shows do you just have to oversee?
Well, it's a lot of programming. It's probably about 120 to 150 hours on an annual basis, depending. And like you said, Becky, it's the 5 Icon series: Frontline, American Experience, and Nova. Those are the 3 documentary series. And then Masterpiece and Antiques Roadshow. And then we have a 6th production group, which is called Studio 6. And that's the group where we produce things that don't fall under any of those 5 umbrellas. So we do public affairs there, we do food shows, we do international topics. And it's also where we kind of experiment and fool around with new ideas.
Is that for a local audience or a
No,
national
those
audience?
are all national shows.
Oh, okay.
So for example, maybe you've seen a couple of the town hall meetings recently. America After Ferguson was one.
Right.
We produced that in conjunction with the 9 networks in St. Louis. And then America After Charleston was another one that we also were partnered up with WEDA and the NewsHour. And we have a couple more of those. And we have the first kind of new debate show coming up. That's also produced out of that group.
Oh, that's exciting.
Yeah, it's really fun.
Oh,
it's like a little boutique studio.
You know, Downton Abbey really, I think, sort of changed the direction for PBS in many ways. We went from like the number 12th network, although I know we're not technically a network, to number 5 though in the placement, right?
Yeah.
So how do you explain that phenomena?
Well, I'm not sure anybody can explain it. We all kind of look at it as lightning in a bottle. And even Rebecca Eaton, who's the executive producer of Masterpiece, in her recent biography, which came out a couple of years ago, she acknowledges right up front that she turned it down.
She turned it down?
When it first came through the door, it was like, do we really need another kind of upstairs, downstairs? No, we don't. And they actually circled back and said, come on. And who knew, what it would turn into. So, and that's a rare one for Rebecca to miss. And, she's really upfront about it in her book. I came to PBS about 3 years into the Downton run. And so that was the year it really turned, season 3, when things really started kicking into high gear. I'm not sure anybody can explain it or really understands why. We have a couple of theories. One was, at the time, if you kind of took a scan through all of the drama on American television, a lot of it was pretty dark. Like Breaking Bad and shows kind of like that. And here was a program which was kind of, it was fun, it was easy. It still touched on some really serious topics, but it did it in a way that was somehow palatable. And maybe there's something to that. Maybe there is something to the idea that it was a kind of a counter program to what the trend was.
So what do you think about, you mentioned Breaking Bad and of course House of Cards and some of those other that are Netflix properties. How do you feel that broadcast television, especially public media, can play in that field of content?
Yeah, such a good question. And it's one of these issues that we're tangling with on a daily basis, because so much is changing and it's changing so fast. There are different ways that these changes impact us. For example, we can't compete in the drama marketplace with big players like Amazon and Netflix. They have bottomless pockets. And, it's become a lot more competitive for us. We have new strategies for kind of getting involved with projects earlier, trying to kind of develop some of our own ideas. And, you know, that's all in the kind of British drama area. Then, you know, Beth Hoppe is you know, thrown the PBS hat in the American drama ring.
Right.
And that is no small task
Right.
either. And so it's clear that, you know, there are big challenges in that space. I think the rule of thumb that we follow is that we provide a kind of quality, substantive content that nobody else is really doing. And as long as we are maintaining that standard and also filling the gaps that are in the broader television grid in this country, then I think we remain relevant. I mean, to my staff, it's constantly conversations about we're in a struggle for relevance. So we need to produce programming nobody else is producing, and we need to do it in a way that you know, is unparalleled.
So you were referring to the American drama that's Mercy Street, and it's going to enter a second season, which is exciting news. And you know, it does take, I think, a little bit for series to get in the groove for folks. But you have a pretty significant history prior coming to PBS with National Geographic, 26 years at National Geographic. So what was the playing card that moved you out of that to PBS, to WGBH?
Yeah, well, that's a good question. So, you know, I had a pretty good setup there.
Yeah, I would think after 26 years.
I was, you know, running the PBS business that the Geographic had. But I worked for a group called National Geographic Television, which was a kind of wholly owned production company owned by the Society. And about 90% of what they produced was for the channel, and the other 10% was what I did for PBS. And, you know, the short answer is I got headhunted. And
really?
yeah, and when I first
At WGBH, they're smart.
yeah, exactly. I'm not, you know, I think that when I sat down with that guy for the very first time, and he said, "Here's what, you know, here's what we're talking about," I was really intrigued because, well, of course, he's going to oversell it, but he described it as, look, this is the best job in television.
Yeah.
And, you know, I thought, well, is that right? I thought I had the best job in television. And in fact, it is a really remarkable job because I'll tell you what the card was. You used that term. What was the card that made the difference? The card that made the difference was that there's a trend in cable television in this country where everybody's kind of going down market, in my view. And the only place that wasn't going down market was PBS. And I looked around, and you know, I worked with a lot of different filmmakers who are all freelance, and you know, they're working for PBS or cable channels or the networks. And everybody was always kind of consistently coming back, and I could see it myself, that the best stuff on television was on PBS. So here was an opportunity to go and work with you know, one of the primary producers of that programming. So, you know, I was due for a midlife crisis anyway. And so it was like, well, what better thing? Hey, how about let's move to another city?
Yeah.
It just kind of worked out. Our youngest kid was, you know, just about to finish high school, and so now we're New Englanders.
So let's talk about you personally. Who are you personally? And tell us about your family. You know, you came from Colorado, right?
I'm originally from Colorado, yeah. I'm the youngest of 5 kids. My parents are originally from Iowa, and they honeymooned in Colorado, and then years later my dad opened up the first office of this company he worked for. He was an engineer out in Colorado. So I grew up there. You know, I was always interested in photography and filmmaking, partly because my dad was, he was always a photographer, and he used movie cameras to kind of put together presentations for jobs. So they would go into these little municipalities out all around Colorado and the Rocky Mountain West and make presentations, and they would use you know, some of the images that he had either taken or you know, shot movies of. So, you know, that all sounds kind of glamorous,
Yeah.
except for when you realize that most of the footage was of like wastewater treatment plants. and so we spent a lot of Sundays, we would go to mass, and then after that we would inevitably find ourselves in some small town sewage treatment plant, like what is going on?
Oh my goodness.
Anyhow, there was a kind of a film thing working. I went to a high school where the teachers allowed you to make movies instead of writing papers. So that was fun. We did that. And then I was a radio, television, and film major in college. Although I couldn't really afford the film stock, so I did radio.
Okay.
And then, I just kind of popped out of there interested in telling stories. And I realized, okay, that's the baseline that is interesting to me. I don't care whether it's film or photography or radio. I like to tell stories. And that's I learned how to do that on the job. I worked as a reporter for a little while. I went to graduate school, and I was thinking I was going to be a foreign correspondent, and realized that I really liked the filmmaking. And I started working at Geographic about a year after getting out of grad school. And I had an opportunity to get in there as vacation relief. They needed somebody to come in for 2 weeks, and I was like, okay, I'll get in there. They'll never get rid of me. And that strategy worked pretty well for 26 years. And I just kind of rose up through the ranks, learned how to make films.
That's pretty interesting advice for young people, isn't it? I mean, not that most of the millennials today would stay in a job probably 26 years, but there is something about taking advantage of an opportunity.
For sure. I mean, I was lucky. There's no question about it. But there's also, I think the hardest thing is that there aren't really jobs that you can stay in for 26 years anymore, I don't think. I mean, it's really rare. I don't imagine either of our kids will, be able to have that kind of longevity unless, one of them, say, goes to work for, local government or the government or something like that. I mean, there just aren't that many opportunities where you can stick around that long.
Now, you have an interesting story about Cookeville, so I hope you're enjoying your visit here, but this isn't your first time here.
That's right. This is my return visit. So early on in my career at the Geographic, actually, I saw this proposal for a contest for human-powered submarine races. And of course that sounded completely outrageous, but what it was an engineering challenge. And a bunch of different universities around the country, from the Naval Academy to Tennessee Tech, were taking advantage of this as a kind of applied engineering class for students in a very interesting kind of realm where they had to build their own thing. Everybody's heard about, okay, build the airplane, build the car, but who's ever heard of build the human-powered sub? So this was the inaugural year. It was sometime in the late 80s, and we had to feature the school from a landlocked state. I mean, that was just too sweet an opportunity. So we came out here and we filmed with these guys for a few days. I remember one scene in particular where they were trying to train the guys who would power it, and it was basically a pedal arrangement. But it's a wet sub, it's full of water, so you had to be on scuba. And so here's a scene of this kind of bucolic country road, kind of a rolling ribbon, and you kind of see in the distance a guy comes over the ridge and then he disappears, and he's on a bike. And he kind of mounts the next hill and he comes into sharp focus, and here's this guy pedaling away, but he's got full scuba on with the tank and the regulator and everything. So, and I remember we shot that right around here somewhere.
Oh, that's
And then we
great.
followed that team from here down to Florida, where they had the first ever race. So yeah, that was my first visit. And I gotta say, the part I didn't tell you previously was that we were introduced to dry rub barbecued ribs. And we had them, the whole crew had them while we were here. And then, we got into the edit, where you're sitting there, watching scene after scene, and you're staying up late trying to put everything together, and everybody's like, do you remember that? Do you remember that barbecue we had? What was the name of that place? And we figured out what it was, and I still have to figure out again what it was. But we had them FedEx us like 4 full racks of ribs, because we were just dying. We were dying for more. It was like that scene in MASH.
That's so funny. Was it Bobby Q's?
I think it was Bobby Keys.
Yeah, I bet. They're still here.
So
you might have to get that before you leave, right? Okay, I'm going to read something. WGBH CEO John Abbott, I love John Abbott, and he's actually been to visit here, described you as a champion who embraces the educational mission of public media. So why is public media, why do you believe that is an educational landscape? What is it about public media that enables us to reach an educational and serve an educational mission?
So to me, it kind of goes back to what I was talking about before in terms of, if you look at the television landscape in this country, there are some really significant gaps in what is provided by the commercial television, the purveyors of commercial television in the United States. Public media plays this essential role that I think gets summed up as, if we don't do it, then it's not going to happen. If we don't do it, it won't get done. And that's critical stuff like Frontline. There really is no hardcore, in-depth, investigative, enterprise journalism happening in this country on that scale. I mean, there's very little long form.
Right.
If not for PBS and the support of PBS and CPB and a number of foundations, Frontline can't do what it does. And it is impactful, important work that, shores up the quality of the democracy in this country. It's the same thing for me in terms of, science programming through NOVA or American history. Look at it this way. American experience, and I'm totally biased here because my degree is also in history. American experience is the only long-form American history program on American television. Right. How could it be that there's only one place where the American story is being told? I mean, to me, it's such a travesty, but it's also a celebration because public media is filling that gap. And frankly, while it's not as pronounced in the science sphere, NOVA does the same thing, and there are very few kind of serious science programs on American television. There are exceptions now and again. Cosmos is a great example, and from Fox and National Geographic Channel. And there are a few others.
Right.
Science Channel, which is a Discovery-owned enterprise, does some quality stuff. But, we live in an age where you need to know how science works in order to understand how, the planet is changing, how we're going to live on this planet. Right. And so for me, public media fills this absolutely essential need. And without us, I think we're lost.
Yeah, I do too. And I'm glad to hear you say that. I totally agree with that. You've won a lot of awards, and I know you would be very humble and not talk about many of those, but you actually were the executive producer in a co-production with NOVA when you were with National Geographic, right? On 8 Genius.
Yep.
And you won the Peabody Award,
That's right,
which is such a prestigious award. How was that experience?
Oh, it was amazing. It was amazing for a number of reasons. And first and foremost, in my career as a filmmaker, the best part are the people you get to work with, the collaborations. And the producer director of that program is a guy named John Rubin, who's an extremely talented guy. And we actually made many films together. But that one leveraged a lot of his original work. He's actually a PhD biologist who happens to be a filmmaker. So, he definitely has the science chops. And, and we collaborated with Paul Apsell at NOVA. And it was just a fantastic experience. The one line that I remember from that film came from one of the scientists we were working with. We're often compared as a species to primates, like 99% similar DNA. And he said, what we're really looking for is the small difference that leads to the big difference. Because, obviously, yes, closest cousin for sure, but, they're also not capable of running a high definition camera or a local public television station. And so what is that little difference that allows us to have that big difference? That part of that film was really fascinating to me.
Do you feel like you learn every time you produce something?
Yeah, in fact I do, and I love that question too, because I often describe my job as a kind of an all-elective university course where you get to choose what you're doing. Now I'm in a slightly different position because I'm not actually making the films anymore, so other people are choosing those topics, but my rule is I watch everything that goes out the door. So and I give notes, and I'm still editorially involved. So I'll dive in on an American Experience or an Antiques Roadshow or a Nova or a Frontline, and it's fantastic. In the morning I've got a First Amendment issue that we're dealing with Frontline. Right. In the middle of the day, there's an issue that we have to reckon with, involving American history. And in the evening, there's a contract issue with Benedict Cumberbatch. So the range is fantastic, and the education that I'm lucky enough to be, the recipient of is just, it's endless and fantastic.
I think you might have the best job in TV.
That's very nice.
Wow. Okay, so I understand that you have written a book, right? And it was sort of a companion piece to a National Geographic special called The President's Photographer.
That's right.
Tell me about that.
Well, one of the last projects I did when I was at the Geographic was a film about presidential photographers. And these are the official presidential photographers, not like the press corps who are following them around. The reason I loved that project and was so lucky to be able to write a book is years before, in 1996, 97, a film that I had worked on called Inside the White House finally made it to PBS. It was a very long gestation project. We started working on it in 1992, and I had done a huge amount of research on that project. At one point in that show, we were watching footage of an arrival ceremony on the South Lawn. I kept seeing this guy. He's like running around. He's over here. He's over here. It's like, who is that guy? Turns out it was President Clinton's official photographer, guy named Bob McNeely. And so I kind of put that away. And then years later, it kind of came back, and I thought, that is a great story. Those people see everything. Who are they? They really are these witnesses, paid witnesses to history, the chroniclers of history. And so we started developing this project and worked with a fantastic filmmaker, Jody Shaliro, who actually produced the special. But as we were doing all those interviews, I was also additionally interviewing everybody we talked to about, their jobs as presidential photographers or the different presidents. And it ended up just being the most interesting way to tell a story of American history.
Wow. And you also did Inside the Vatican.
Yeah.
I think people are fascinated by those behind the scenes sort of opportunities.
Yeah. Well, I think partly because, these are super familiar things to us. You look at the White House and you go, oh, yeah, White House, of course, Vatican, yeah, I know what that's all about. Not really. It's maybe more, it's kind of this strange mix of familiarity and not really knowing what goes on there. And that I think is the twist in those stories, is that you're able to kind of get inside and tell them. And my yen was for telling those stories through the experiences of the people who defined those places with their experiences. Whether it was, for example, we actually followed around the Pope's photographer, or a Swiss guard, or a nun who's kind of restoring one of Raphael's tapestries, or some archbishop who's about to be kind of elevated to cardinal. Those stories, it's the individuals who make that place interesting. Yeah, spectacular architecture. Same with the White House. It's cool buildings, cool history about the building, but it's the people who kind of build it. And to me, that's really the best way to tell a story.
We're going to run out of time before I have all these questions I want to ask you, but let's talk about people. Who influences you the most?
You mean like...
in your life.
Just in general?
Just in general.
So, probably my siblings. my parents and my siblings. Really remarkable parents are both still alive. They're in their 90s. Smart people, even-handed people, kind of just people. And they raised a bunch of kids who are all very different from each other, but who are, all kind of, they're like all counselors. Like my sister's a clinical psychologist, my oldest brother's a geologist, my next brother's a federal judge, and my next brother's a physician. And so, you've got all these different brains who have unique perspectives on the world, and they had a huge influence on me. And then I would say, next in line would be various university professors. And there's no single individual who I would say, other than like really my mom and dad, who had that kind of major influence. There are different kind of filmic influences and people in my career who helped me kind of understand the value of collaboration, which is really what filmmaking and I think successful work is. That one, I could go for days on that one, Becky.
Thank you. Thank you for making a
so
return
welcome.
trip to Cookeville in the Upper Cumberland, and we hope this won't be your last.
Thank you very much. Pleasure to be here.